Welcome to A-Push. Today we're going to talk about the critical period, the time when the Articles of Confederation began to break down, and we saw the shift towards this new thing called the Constitution. It's generally called the critical period because this transition between sort of placeholder governments and then more solid constitutional systems is often the time when revolutions go off the rails, when more radical groups seize control, and when the whole experiment really takes a very different turn than it had at the beginning. So let's talk about whether or not that happened in the United States. Here are your basic objectives. Take a moment to copy them down and process them, and then we'll be moving forward to talk about the breakdown of the Articles of Confederation. The Articles of Confederation failed for all the obvious reasons that anyone who knows anything about the structure of the Articles could have seen in advance. Mostly trade and money. So the lack of any ability to raise any revenue, coupled with the crippling debt that both the central government and the states were in after the revolution, made the Articles of Revolution pretty much a dead letter. Because we needed such a majority in order to pass votes and unanimity to pass any amendments, all attempts to pass any sort of impost tax or any sort of or tariffs or anything else were stymied by one state or another, honestly, usually either Delaware or Rhode Island. And Delaware or Rhode Island constantly throwing wrenches in this process to try to get the United States on sound financial footing meant that it's possible that the Union could have just broken up right then. So let's talk about why it didn't and why it almost did. The other issue that the Articles had is we had no standing navy, and so the United States ships had been getting attacked by pirates operating off the coast of North Africa. And for some reason, and I can't figure out why, the British Navy now refused to protect American shipping, leaving us at the mercy of these Barbary pirates. So that's a clear problem because, again, no navy. We also started to see border disputes between states. We kind of talked about this as we talked about westward expansion, but this gives you an example of the extent of the problem, because you can see these are the province of Pennsylvania's land claims. So where does the province of Pennsylvania end? Does it end all the way up here in New York? Is this part of it part of Connecticut? How about this part here that's claimed by Virginia? And how about the lower counties? Is Delaware an independent state? Who knows? And you could go, of course, to the Articles government in order to try to solve these problems, but without any executive power and demanding unanimity or a supermajority to get most anything done, none of these problems were solved by the Articles. Regulation of trade was also a huge issue. Of course, Congress could not raise any money without asking the states. And so the Congress would repeatedly ask the states for money, and then the states would say no. So not great. We tried to pass a 5% impost tax, but first Rhode Island blocked it, and then later Delaware would block it. So no tax revenue. And each state set up their own tariff barriers between other states, meaning that each state operated basically as its own independent unit, and trade between all the various states broke down almost immediately. And then you have Shaes Rebellion, which was not a catalyst to the calling of the Constitutional Convention, but definitely pushed states that were on the fence about it into sending representatives and convinced everyone that we needed to actually change systems. So let's talk Shaes Rebellion in the briefest of terms. Shaes Rebellion was a rebellion of farmers in western Massachusetts named after Daniel Shaes, who was a Revolutionary War veteran who was paid for his service in worthless Continental script, and then a tax collector was going to foreclose upon his farm. So he just spent several years fighting for the revolution in order to free the country, and then the government, or more importantly, financiers in Boston, were going to take his farm. So how do we deal with this problem? They asked the governor of Massachusetts, John Hancock, what to do about it. He's, of course, a populist, friend of the people, so he's clearly got an answer. But unfortunately, John Hancock came down with a sudden and mysterious illness and was forced to resign the governorship, giving the post over to a guy named John Bowdoin. And we'll talk more about Bowdoin in a second. Surprisingly enough, Sam Adams, now that he had money and was established in Boston, was against the rebellion. And so we're starting to see the Founding Fathers turning from sort of populist rabble-rousers into the establishment who wants to pursue law and order, which it's interesting how that happens. Once you get power, all of a sudden your perspective on what is legal and what is not legal changes somewhat drastically. The governor raised a militia and sent them out in order to fight the Shaes rebels. And unsurprisingly, the militia, which was made up of mostly poor farmers, refused. And so the governor had to instead, well, and then of course the governor called the Articles Congress. I should have mentioned this earlier, but called up the Articles of Confederation government, the Congress, for troops. The articles asked the states for troops or money, and the states said no. So that's that. So Massachusetts passed the Riot Act, which prevented people from meeting in groups of more than 12. The governor then passed around a collection plate to the wealthy merchants of Boston, and they formed their own private militia, and Shaes Rebellion was put down relatively quickly. But this clearly showed both the impotence of the federal government and the difficulties facing Western farmers that the Articles of Confederation government was unequal to solve. So, with Shaes Rebellion raging, representatives began to meet in order to try to revise or maybe even throw out the Articles of Confederation. This is the famous Annapolis Convention, organized mostly by James Madison and Alexander Hamilton, both of whom believed that the Articles were fatally flawed and would need to be either reformed or completely thrown out. And so after meeting in Annapolis, Maryland, with only 5 states, they ended up calling for a larger convention in Philadelphia, mostly because it was the home of Benjamin Franklin, and he was too old to travel at that point. So that brings us to the Constitutional Convention. The Constitutional Convention was a meeting, again, of all of the states trying to reform and change the Articles of Confederation. It had very little legal standing, because you need to, within the Articles system, you need unanimity to reform the Articles of Confederation. And the people who'd already been elected to the Articles Congress had very little interest in changing the system, because it would probably mean they would lose all their power. But they joined together anyway, and because there were visionaries like Madison, Hamilton, Benjamin Franklin, and most importantly, George Washington was called out of his retirement and at his Mount Vernon farm and brought back to lend credence and weight to the process. There was enough gravitas in the room that people might actually listen. Since we don't really know what actually happened at the convention, because it was closed to the public and no one took extensive notes, and so all we have are the documents to come out of it afterwards and some recollections of the people who were there. James Madison was the visionary who came up with pretty much the whole first system, and it's the rough draft that's eventually going to become the Constitution, which is why Madison is known as the father of the Constitution. Hamilton also came up with a much stronger federal plan that would give significantly more power to the executive and to the upper house of Congress. But all of these guys were in general in favor of a stronger centralized government. All of these guys who were in favor of this system were known as Federalists, with the idea that they would divide the power amongst a series of different houses and then give other powers to the states. And so power would be diffuse because, of course, it's divided between the 3 branches of government, and then also divided between a stronger central government and state governments, which would also have significant power and autonomy. And so the people who supported this new constitution were known as the Federalists, whereas the people who opposed them were anti-Federalists. Federalists also wanted to insulate power in the Constitution. And so, for example, state legislatures would elect senators, with the idea being that state legislatures are a little bit more educated and established than the people in general. And then the senators would be even more leading citizens. And from the early years, presidential electors would elect the president using the people's vote as more of a recommendation than a requirement. So as far as direct democracy or direct democratic power, the only group that the people could really influence was the House of Representatives, or the People's House, with the Senate being a more august, sort of slower moving body that would theoretically check the fickle, ever-changing whims of the mob. At the heart of the new Constitution was the Great Compromise between large states and small states. James Madison's original plan had called for 2 houses, but representation to be based on population. Another proposal, the New Jersey Plan, was much closer to the Articles, with every state getting equal representation. And so we get the Great Compromise, with the 2 houses, with the Senate, the upper house providing equal representation, whereas representation in the House is proportional to population. So that's one of the compromises at the heart of the Constitution. And the other is a horrific 3/5 compromise between the southern states and the northern states. The southern states wanted slaves to count for population, but not for taxation and not for the purposes of providing taxation to the federal government. The northern states did not want slaves to count for population, but did want them to count for taxation. So we came up with this happy compromise where enslaved people would now count as 3/5 of a person for both representation and taxation. So that's horrific and in the Constitution. And so we get this thing called the Constitution, which hopefully you've read. If not, I have a copy in my room. I'll more than happily lend it to you. And we get into the battle for ratification because we decided that the Constitution couldn't go into effect unless 2/3 of the states ratified it. We kicked out the whole unanimity thing because we were tired of Rhode Island and Delaware basically torpedoing the process for everybody. And so as a result, we got into this battle between the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists. The Federalists, most importantly led by James Madison, Alexander Hamilton, and John Jay, favored the Constitution, whereas the Anti-Federalists, led by Patrick Henry, Richard Henry Lee, Samuel Adams, who is now apparently against the Constitution, wanted something closer to the Articles of Confederation government. The real sticking point and sort of the heart of this new Constitution is the Elastic Clause, Article 1, Section 8, Clause 18, which says that Congress has the power to pass any laws which are necessary and proper for carrying out its responsibilities. So although the Constitution is a series of clearly enumerated laws, the Elastic Clause gives Congress broad authority to legislate on things that are not specifically listed in the Constitution. For the Federalists, this was seen as necessary to create a living document that could grow over time and deal with challenges that the Founding Fathers might not have anticipated. For the Anti-Federalists, this was a blank check for Congress to do anything, and therefore was a non-starter because it gave Congress more or less unlimited power. So, in order to try to convince or to try to lay out the justification for the Elastic Clause and the Constitution in general, we got the Federalist Papers, which are a series of essays anonymously published, quote unquote, mostly written by Hamilton, but some written by Madison and Jay, to lay out the basic principles in the Constitution. You should definitely read them. They're as close to getting a window into the Founding Fathers' ideology and arguments as you can get. And although they were not important in the battle for ratification, they are very important in interpreting the Constitution going forward. The Anti-Federalists also wrote some papers, but because, of course, they lost, they were not as well read or well used. So here's the battle for ratification. Take a minute and pause and try to pull out exactly what's going on here, because it's important for you to try to work to analyze these maps of popular support. Obviously, there's some clear geographical divides here, with coastal regions being more in favor of a stronger government and more rural inland regions not being worried about of a government overexerting power and becoming tyrannical and overly taxing. The two states that were most strongly fighting against this were New York and Virginia. And so the battle for New York and Virginia was incredibly fierce, with Hamilton spearheading the pro-Federalist camp in New York and James Madison spearheading the battle in Virginia. In the end, if Virginia and New York didn't ratify it, New Hampshire had already ratified it, so the Constitution was going into effect. But if New York and Virginia, two of the largest and most populous states, did not ratify it, then we could all of a sudden have the country split apart, with the states ratifying the Constitution being their own country and Virginia and New York becoming their own independent countries. But fortunately, both of these states ratified it. The Constitution went into effect. Yeah. So here's the basic breakdown. Rhode Island didn't end up not ratifying it until about 3 years later, with Rhode Island finally jumping on board because they quickly realized that being their own independent country in the midst of a massive republic totally surrounding them was probably not in their long-term best interests. So with that, the Constitution goes into effect. And one of the things that the Federalists pushed in order to get Anti-Federalists to support them was a Bill of Rights, which was 10 amendments to the Constitution tacked on immediately after ratification. Hopefully you're familiar with the Bill of Rights. These are a list of things that the federal government cannot do in order to try to limit the power of the Elastic Clause. So this was one of the selling points to get Anti-Federalists on board, and the Constitution, the government we still use today, was born. Here are your objectives for today. Take a moment to make sure you can provide substantive answers for them. And we'll come back tomorrow to talk about the first presidency in United States history.